One of the things that a lot of policymakers have to worry about is that it could be some mixture of economic spillovers and learning. There's much less chance of economic spillovers being a major effect in this sort of policy area. This is the question about whether or not these laws are effective, right? So if states are passing all of these laws, are they effective? You know, and the answer to that from the public health literature is yes. Now, it's not an unequivocal yes, right? There are some people who disagree, but by and large, the best studies have shown that youth access laws do make it more difficult for kids, teenagers in particular, to buy cigarettes. They do it in part by changing the behavior of retailers, and that these laws are also associated with a decrease in smoking rates. The one thing we don't have is anything about enforcement. And that would be nice to have. We don't have those measures. There's, I mean, Tony has a paper about drinking and driving laws, where, you know, it's the perception of enforcement can have a big effect. And I would think that that would matter here too, but we simply don't have data on that. Okay, so what sorts of laws are we talking about here? So what this figure shows is a couple different things. On the left, it shows the different sorts of laws that we have coded. And it shows the red bar, the number of states that had these sorts of laws by 2000, which is in the middle of the period we're looking at. For reference, I also showed what this looked like in 1980, which is farther back than our tests will go. But it's just to give you a sense of where things started and where they've ended up. So you see there's a fair amount of variation. Just going over what some of these are. BDs are, you know, the restrictions on having the small rolled cigarettes. There's states have laws about passing random inspections of stores and to make sure that they're complying with the different regulations. Age requirement, that was mandated eventually. It initially was passed and states had to do it by a certain point, so they all did it at age 18. Some states have created oversight boards, put restrictions on how cigarettes can be shipped or who's involved with shipping. Some have laws that cigarettes need to be sold behind a counter. There's education programs. Laws restricting where stores selling cigarettes can be located. Penalties for vendors who sell cigarettes to minors. Some places the vendors have to be licensed. You have to post signs saying you have to be of age to buy cigarettes. Some require IDs. Cigarettes being sold out of pack is big for two reasons. One is if you can buy cigarettes one or two at a time, it decreases the cost, which makes it easier for kids to buy cigarettes. The other is it doesn't come with the warning labels on it. Location of vending machines, bans on free distribution of cigarettes at things like sporting events, and penalties for kids who get caught smoking. Okay, one thing we don't have in here, and I actually, in the Q&A, I'd be interested to hear what people think about it, because we wrestled with this and we haven't figured out a great way to deal with it. We don't have taxes in here. Okay, now taxes clearly affect youth smoking rates. They're very sensitive to the price of cigarettes. But that's not going to be what our dependent variable. Our dependent variable is going to be whether or not states imitate other states. And so since taxes can be adopted for a broad range of reasons, whereas these are adopted for specific reasons of youth access, we're sticking to this set of things. Okay, so what data do we have? First, we have data on state adoption. So the National Cancer Institute has this database of all state laws that have been adopted in the area of anti-smoking policy. So we went through and we coded all of these to see whether they fell into any of the categories we were talking about. We got data on local adoptions from the American Non-Smokers' Right Foundation, which keeps track of all cities and when they passed laws and what the types of laws were and so on. Okay, so once we have these things, that gives us the information about which states have adopted laws and which cities have adopted laws. But we also need to have a measure of success. And what we've got here is a couple different things. The first is compliance with the Sinar Amendment. This is named after Mike Sinar, who introduced it. And what this does is it requires, sorry, it's too many. It requires states to lower the rate at which individuals, kids under the age of 18, can purchase cigarettes. Okay, so it was a law passed in the early 1990s that basically told states this is something they had to do. Why did they have to do it? This is in a tradition of the national government telling states that they don't have to do something. They have a choice, but if they don't do it, they lose money. And so this is, the organization is SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They have these, the substance abuse prevention and treatment block grants that they give to the states, 40% of which can be withheld if the states are not in compliance with both the specific age requirement and with the goal of lowering, if they're not lowering the rates. And it ends up being real money. It's like, it's up to $2 billion a year during this time that SAMHSA was giving out. For states, it ranged from $2.5 million for treatment programs to $220 million. So it gives the states a real incentive to do this. We also have another measure of success. So that really gets at this notion of access. Can kids get cigarettes? The other measure comes from the Youth Behavioral Risk Surveillance Survey, which is a survey that's done of teenagers. It's administered by the CDC, and it monitors 6 categories of risky behavior. I won't go into the other ones, but as you can see, one of them is tobacco use. And this lets, it gives information. The question that we use is, have you smoked within the past 30 days? Okay. Now, neither of these measures is perfect, right? Because states know they have this incentive to show that their rates are decreasing. And so they have, every incentive to show that they're improving. Kids lie on these surveys, and so neither of them are perfect, but they're both good measures. They're both measures of success, and they both tell us something about how well these policies have worked. Just to give you a sense, that's what I just said. Just to give you a sense of the variation, this is for the Sinar Amendment in 2000. What we see is the violation rates or the noncompliance rates range from about 7-8%, Louisiana, South Dakota. I have no idea what was going on in Wyoming, but some of the other states, I meant to look to see where California was and I forgot. But you see there's a pretty wide variation here in compliance rates over time. Similarly, if we look at youth smoking rates, we see a good range where the states with the highest amounts of smoking are kids. It's about 23% of kids are smoking there, down to the states in which fewer kids are smoking, California, Utah, places like that. It's interesting looking at this because it's not just the tobacco states that are at the high end. There's some of the upper Midwest states. And it's not that all tobacco growing states are high rates of smoking states. So Virginia would be an example of that. But again, you can see the point of this is just to show me that there is a fair amount of variation on these things. Okay, so now we've got our measures. We've got our measures of success. We've got our measures of whether states have adopted laws or not. So what's the approach that we use? Well, we do something that's become pretty standard in the policy diffusion literature, which is an event history analysis. The twist we have on it here is it's a dyad year event history analysis. And we look at the data from 96 through 2002 for one of them, one of the measures of success, 92 through 2002 for the other. What we do for the dyad year is we look at every pair of states. So state A, which is the one that's considering adopting, paired with state B, which might or might not have already adopted it. So what this means is that we've got 50 times 49 state pairs for each, possible pairs for each year in the analysis. And what we ask is, when does state A adopt state B's policies? And then we have a lot of methodological controls that we put in. The first thing is we cluster by state B that in our analysis, there might be some things about state B that make it more or less likely to be followed by other states. And to the extent we're not controlling for these, we want to not treat the observations as if they're independent. We can do it by other ways of clustering and end up with very similar sorts of results. We put in time trends to account for temporal dependence. We control for the previous number of laws adopted because as states have adopted more, they have fewer options about what to adopt later on. And the final thing we do is Fred Bemke has a very nice paper in which he looked at a lot of studies, many of which take place in international relations, that look at these dyads and found that it's easy to come up with spurious findings if you don't do something, which is you have to make sure that state A has an opportunity to adopt state B. So if state A has already adopted every policy state B has done, there's simply nothing they can do to move toward state B. Okay, so what do we use as a dependent variable? We use a couple different ones, actually. The simplest one is just a matter of whether there's movement towards state B. So has state A adopted policies that move it in the direction of state B? And the way we do this, sorry about this, it's not responding sometimes. It takes on a value of 1 if state A adopts policy change and more of the laws it adopts move it towards state A than move away from state B, then move away from state B. I'll give an example in a second. This is just basically, are you moving more toward a state than you're moving away from it in the terms of the policies you're adopting? The second thing is we look at the amount of movement towards state B, which is the number of state A policy components that are changed in a direction towards state B minus the number that are changed moving away from state B. So let's give the example just because it's easier to see. So suppose state A in year T has 2 laws on the books, the age requirements and the law restricting that vending machines can only be sold in bars or places where people have to be 21 to get in. Then you've got state B in the same year has a set of things. They have, like state A, age requirements, and they have a vending machine law. But they also have another set of laws. So they have the youth penalties. I have a different order now. Vendor licensing, youth penalties, free distribution, out-of-pack sales, and sign posting. So clearly state A meets the condition that it can move towards state B. And so what happens now if in state A, year T plus 1, they adopt some laws? Well, suppose they adopt an ID law. State B doesn't have that sort of law, so we count that as a movement away from what state B wants. I'm sorry, from what state B has. But then they adopt 4 other policies that correspond to things that state B has, okay? In this case, we would say state A moved toward state B in 4 areas and away from it in 1. So by our first dependent variable, which is just the dichotomous one, it takes on a value of 1. Which is basically saying that state A is moving in the general direction of state B. The second variable is the continuous one, and that says that if we look at the amount of movement, state A has moved toward B in 4 areas and away in 1. There are other ways that we've been exploring coding this. This is the one that we like because it does capture the idea that we've been talking about. We can just look to see if there's any movement at all. The results end up being pretty similar, although a little bit weaker. We're talking about doing some other things, creating sort of a correlation between what the 2 states have at one period and then what the 2 states have at the next period and seeing if that correlation got stronger or weaker. Yeah.
You put in some sort of variable for propinquity or something? Have I missed it? You know, is the state A adjacent to state B?
Yeah, we'll get to, I'm going to get to that in the next slide. Maybe not the next slide, but in a couple slides. Yeah. Yeah.
So, if that's all it said in the paper, I wouldn't know how to code states. So, what's the distance metric I use? So I understand on the second dependent variable, so you put in distance metric where everything is 0, 1 scale, and we just add them up or subtract them, add and subtract.
Yeah.
But I mean, ID may be, you know, really big dimension, and the other form may be really little.
Yeah.
And if it's 0, 1, so your first variable, how do I know how to code that as moving closer or further away?
Well,
maybe ID is worth nothing, and the other 4, you know, that's really where the action is.
Yeah, so I mean, that is something that we've thought about. And if you look at the list of things, there are a couple of them that are much more minor than the other ones. What we're doing right now is we're coding them, we're treating them, we're weighting them all equally, basically.
And youth penalties are youth penalties are youth penalties.
Yeah, so that's another thing that we've had to do is that we've ignored the variation in these things. So it could be, you know, in Kentucky, I think the penalty for a kid, this is actual, the penalty for a kid caught smoking in school was $5. And in other states, it's a much higher fine that they end up paying. And so we have, for this analysis, yeah, I mean, we've abstracted away from all of those differences. So it does make it a little bit more blunt, because you could have, I mean, to take what you were talking about, you know, if ID doesn't matter that much, we're weighting it as heavily as something that might matter a lot, such as youth penalties, but then we're treating all youth penalties the same. Other states do nothing for a while, and then we'll adopt 7 of these all at once. And we looked at this just to see if there was any sort of pattern. So are they adopting one of these with others? And we didn't see any patterns like that. The one pattern we did see, and this is a little bit, it makes sense when you think about it. They all had to adopt these age restrictions. So we often see that when they adopt the age restrictions, they adopt a couple other policies at the same time. But it's not something where, well, states that are going to do this immediately first go toward out-of-packet sales or vending machine things. Some start out with those things, others start out with youth penalties, and others start out with vendor penalties. And this is something we spent a fair amount of time looking at, and it's just never able to sort of pin down, is there a pattern here that we should be using to tell us how to do this a little bit better?
Legislatures tend not to go away and erase laws.
Right.
So they adopt ID, they don't then go back and eliminate ID and adopt the other 4 things.
That's right.
So we don't get a single directional move. They don't undo something so they can actually literally move closer to being like state B.
Right.
Or the other way, yeah, like state B.
Yeah, yeah. But what, I mean, so we are already sort of taking that into account when we look at the comparison between the 2 states at time t. It takes into account whether state A has already done some of the things that state B has. All right. Okay, so the key independent variables then, first thing we would need to look at is, the primary thing we want to look at is policy success. And here the way we do this is we look at the relative success of state B. So first, for sign R, we look at noncompliance. So we look at noncompliance in state A versus noncompliance in state B. Let me just say a bit more about this. So what states had to do is they had to propose to SAMHSA, to the federal government agency that was running this, how they were going to check to see whether kids were able to buy cigarettes in the state. And so basically what they did is they told states to set up sting operations, where states would get kids to go out and see if they could buy cigarettes, and that's what states had to report back on. They also had to submit their very detailed plans for how they were going to do this, and they had to get these plans approved. So because, and SAMHSA did send a bunch of these back to the states saying, no, we won't approve this, and if you don't fix this plan, then you'll lose your funds. States were doing, this is my favorite one, and I can't remember which state did it, but you want to look good, right? And so you want kids who go in and try to buy cigarettes to be turned away. So how do you do that? You send in a 10-year-old kid. If they're equally non-compliant, 20%, 20%, this is a value of 1. If state A is non-compliant 40% of the time, and state B is non-compliant 20% of the time, then it's a situation where A does have something to learn from B because B is doing much better in this regard. We do something similar for the youth smoking rates. We look at the rate in state A, rate in state B. So if the rate in state A is much higher than in state B, it wants to imitate state B. This means then that as this value goes up, we should see A wanting to learn from B. And that is our prediction. Higher values indicate B is more successful, and our prediction is positive that A can learn from B. The independent variables I've already described. in general. The first is legislative professionalism. For this, there's different measures of this. We rely on a very standard one. Pev has created an index that takes into account the things I mentioned, days in session, committees, salary, and so on, and rates legislatures. The way it does is it's relative to the US Congress. So at the high end, you have California, New York, Michigan, states like that. At the low end, you have states like Wyoming, North Dakota that don't meet very frequently. Okay, for the policy expertise, what we do is we look at the local adoptions. And so this is looking at the city laws as a proportion of the state population. So if there were 10 cities of 50,000 each that have adopted these laws, it's 500,000 out of the population of 5 million in the state. This takes on a value of 10%. So those are the key independent variables. Yeah.
One question, is the legislative activity captured in the legislative professionalism? So like if some states are churning out lots and lots of new laws, where other states it's very little change, is that something that?
Yeah, so we do include that for that very reason, that states that are more professionalized are more likely to pass laws. Okay. But remember, our dependent variable is not going to be whether they pass the law, it's whether they move toward what another state has done.
Sure.
Yeah.
Why do we believe we have unconfoundedness here? So the you have policy variables on both sides of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed, you have smoking policy variables on both sides of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we satisfy SUPA?
So in this case, what we've got for the local adoptions is an issue. So what we've gotten for the local adoptions is we look to see whether they have adopted youth access laws of any type. What we've got on the dependent variable then is whether or not they're moving in the direction of another state. So it's not quite that we're looking at it's not that we're looking at whether or not they've adopted policies or not. So what we've got on the right-hand side is the measures of success, and we've also got these measures of adoptions. Okay. On the left-hand side, am I getting at what you're asking or no? On the left-hand side, we've got whether or not they're moving toward what the other states have done.
I mean, I don't understand how we. I mean, I'm a simple-minded kind of guy, so.
Always beware of questions that start that way.
So we need a set of states at time t that are treated, and a set of states at time t that are controlled.
Yeah.
And if we're deciding whether we're creating a variable, since we don't actually observe treatment,
Mm-hmm.
so you're creating treatment.
Right.
The creation of the variable treatment is also what is the state's doing, their dependent variable in some sense. So how is our assignment to treatment, so assignment to group, whether treatment or control, how is that unconfounded with how we determine the dependent variable? And how do I know, basically? Yeah. I mean, I'm willing to buy it here so you can move on.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to say that I need to think more about that. I think that's a good question, and I need to think more about what the response to that would be. But that's a good point. Yeah. All right, let me show you what the other variables we include here are. One is about, let me write that down. Founding. Okay. One of the things we want to do is control for whether or not state B has certain characteristics that make it more likely to be imitated. Big literature in health policy that certain states are seen as leaders. Which ones are those? They're the big states, and they're the states that are wealthy. So when those states tend to adopt policies, other states just tend to follow along what they're doing. The second thing is we want to look at similarities between states. So here we look to see whether states are neighboring states, And these are all the sort of standard variables that are included in diffusion models. Whether they have the same type of government in terms of unified Republican, unified Democrat, and so on. The overall ideology of, say, which we use an off-the-shelf measure, which may or not be a great one, but it's used pretty often by state politics people. We look at tobacco production and tobacco consumption. Okay, so these are the things that we control for in here. We also, I'll just mention this right now, we also look to see whether these similarities interact with the success variables, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Okay, so this is the first test of the simple learning hypothesis. The key thing we want to look at here is the sign-on noncompliance ratio and the youth smoking rate ratio. I'll talk a little bit more about what those coefficients mean in substantive terms. I just want to mention that we don't see any evidence that states are adopting the policies that are found in these leader states. We do see evidence that they're adopting policies found in more successful states. So we're not seeing necessarily that it's just imitation of what the biggest states have done, but it's more based on which states have been successful. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I think it might fit in here pretty well too. Is there any correlation between your legislative professionalism and the leader state status?
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
Or with ideology? Are democratic states more likely to be higher professionalism?
I'm just sort of going through the list of states that I can think of that are at the top end of that. Yeah, yeah, I think there is and it makes sense, right?
Right, sure,
Yeah.
for your government.
Do you have GAM's new measure of legislative professionalism that actually counts the number of days they were in session as opposed to what their state constitutions say? Because most of the states in the
Right.
older data set, they just look at the state constitution, but they have special sessions.
That's right.
You know, things like,
So-
states like Texas, which are coded very low, the committees stay in session all the time.
Right. And then there's other states that look like they're in session, but they're not actually meeting. They just keep
Yeah.
the session open for that.
So they get paid, yeah.
I think that Squire counts those, but I'm not 100% sure about that.
Yeah, Gerald has a new measure. I just don't know if Ev adopted it or what.
Yeah,
I just can't remember when those came about.
yeah, yeah. It's also interesting with the professionalism measure that if you break it out, I mean, you think that some of these might be more important than others, but we decided to just go with a single measure of that. We also don't see a lot of evidence that these sort of standard interstate considerations matter. We do see that the same unified government matters. I'll mention here that, well, actually, let me just say a little bit about what the overall findings are. The first model, by the way, is based on the logit analysis with the 0-1 dependent variable. This is based on the movement, so it's a continuous variable. It can range from -16 to +16. It doesn't range quite so much, in fact. Okay, so what we can do is we can say if we have a change from -1 standard deviation to +1 standard deviation in either of our success measures, what does that do to the predicted probability of moving toward state B? First, for the sign-on non-compliance, it changes the probabilities from 0.38 to 0.51. Smaller effect for the youth smoking rate, but still something that changes in a positive direction. And if both of them change, we go from being a third of the times where they're going to move towards state B to being a case where they're more than likely to do it. We get similar findings for Model 2, although the effects are a little bit smaller. Now let me just talk about a few additional tests that we ran. One of the things we looked at is to see whether trends mattered or changes in these levels mattered. We find that if you look at the overall trend, so from the beginning of the period to the end, if you measure it that way rather than just what's the current difference between the two states, that can have an effect. We didn't find any effect for the immediate change. So was there an immediate change in what states have done in terms of how successful they've been? We did find that if we look at any version of A moving toward B, we found that the results were similar to what we just showed. We also included non-ratio measures of success, so it doesn't matter if B is more successful than you just imitate B if they're overall having success in this area. And the results end up pretty similar to what we've got here. The one thing that, to be honest, when we started this paper, the thing that I thought would be most likely to come out of it is that it would be the combined effect of success and similarity. And to that end, we looked at a number of different things to see whether is it a combination of a successful state that's a neighbor state or a successful state that is also a tobacco growing state like you are, and so on. We find a little bit of evidence for this. So if we interact the SINAR measure with the difference in percent smokers between states, that ends up looking the way we'd expect it to look. And there's one other like that, but it was nothing approaching a consistent set of results for the interaction between these things, which surprised me. Okay, so that's the simple hypothesis. We want to turn now to the conditional hypothesis. And again, there's these two potential effects. One is that having more capacity in the legislature can enhance learning. The other is that it can diminish learning. And so to get at this, what we do is a standard thing. We interact success measures with the legislative professionalism measures. And I'll show you the chart with the results, but then I'll also show you a figure to make it easier to look at. What we're interested in here are the interactions. By the way, we separated these out into the SINAR noncompliance ratio in Model 3 and the youth smoking ratio in Model 4. And the reason we did that is because of collinearity between the interacted terms. If we put them together, and it's easier to interpret them. If we put them together, we end up with similar results. Yeah, I don't know if you had a question.
Well, I was looking at your first model and I was listening to you describe the dyads. And the first model, you've got an end of a much different end than what you have now.
Yeah.
14 something. And
So the difference is that so we have missing values for some of these things. The surveys aren't done in each year, for example. And in the first model, we're including both measures together. Okay, and so it's got to be something where we've got a value for each of the things in each of the years.
That's using listwise deletion.
Yeah.
And where does 2694 come from?
So that's the number of state dyads in which state A has the opportunity to imitate something that state B has done, and that state A has taken action.
Okay, so how many of the n's are 0?
How many of the n's are 0?
So why would we just put up a big matrix of state year? How many of the dependent variables are 0?
Yeah.
How often does the dependent variable take on a value of 0? How's that?
I'm just looking it up.
What percentage of the time?
It looks like the mean value for it is 0.4. So 40% of the time there's movement toward it, 60% there's not. Now we've eliminated all of the cases in which A can't move toward state B. So that eliminates a lot of the cases. Okay, so this.
Chuck, one question. This is not the logit. This is your dependent variable is the distance at
Yeah.
this point, right?
Oh, right. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
So it's not.
Yeah. So this is not right. This is not the logit version. This is the movement variable.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't have empty cells.
That's right. Okay. In this one, like I said, we split them up because they're collinear. What we do then is we plot the marginal effects to see what happens, and I noticed there's a mistake in this. It should say SINAR noncompliance. So what this shows is a couple different things. The first is that it shows the effect of the SINAR noncompliance on emulation, whether you move toward the other states and how much. And it allows it to vary by the state legislative professionalism. And so what we see is that for any level of state legislative professionalism, that there is this positive effect. So across the board, regardless of state legislative professionalism, states are learning from other states. But the other thing is that There's a significant difference between the low end and the high end of state legislative professionalism. In other words, the marginal effect is about 3 times bigger at the high end than it is at the low end, indicating that it's support for the idea that as states become more professionalized, that they're more likely to learn from what other states are doing. Similarly, this is for smoking rates, and we see something similar. Now, the average value of state legislative professionalism is about 0.2. So for states that have above average professionalism, we see that there is this effect. For states that have low levels of professionalism, we see that they aren't learning as much from other states. So it differs a little bit from the SINAR graph, just in the sense that we see this lower bound on the effect. But overall, it's telling a pretty similar story between them. Now, we can also then look at the policy expertise hypotheses in the same way. And again, there's 2 potential effects. There's this complementary effect where the more local experiments there are, the more it is likely that states will learn from what other states are doing, or it can be a substitution effect. So similarly, we interact the success measures with local adoptions here. And again, the chart that's hard to see. Here we don't find in the first model, which is looking at the SINAR ratio, a significant effect. The SINAR noncompliance ratio by itself is significant. For the smoking rates ratio, we do see a significant effect for the interaction term. Again, it's easier to see what's going on here if we plot these. So this first one is looking again at SINAR noncompliance. We see a similar pattern to what we saw earlier. Here we've got the proportion of state A population that's covered by local laws. As this increases, states are more likely to follow what other states that have been successful are doing. It's positive across the whole range. It's not, though, significantly different at higher levels than at lower levels. So it looks positive, but we don't see the significance. We find a very similar thing to the earlier result here if we look at the smoking rates variable. Okay, where at low levels, states that have very little local experimentation, we see that there's not a lot of learning that goes on from other states, but as this increases, we see that the marginal effect goes up and becomes significant. So overall, we can say a couple things. One is that political expertise, the strong professionalism, enhances external learning, and that policy expertise complements it. So let me just close with a few conclusions about what we've done, and then we can open it up for more questions. So the first thing is that external learning from the success of other states is robust. Okay, we find it measuring it in a variety of different ways. We find that there is this strong tendency for states to be more likely to adopt what other states have done if those states have been successful. It doesn't matter if they're neighbors or similar ideologically. It just ends up being the case that the more successful a state is, the more likely it is to be followed. There's some evidence that states do follow what similar states are doing, but it's mixed. And there's some evidence that they follow what bigger and richer states are doing. But the more interesting finding, I think, the conditional one, is that expertise increases the likelihood of learning from success. So whether it's legislative expertise or the policy expertise gained from internal adoptions. Now, the one thing that I want to mention just as the last thing is I think there's some interesting normative implications if our analysis is right. One of which is that whatever the pros and cons of having a more or less professionalized legislature is, what this shows is that if one of the ideas of allowing states to adopt different policies is that they can learn from each other and learn which policies are best, this indicates that it's the more professionalized states that are going to be able to do that compared to the less professionalized states. The second thing is it shows that states would probably be better off allowing a lot of local experimentation rather than passing laws. I was talking to somebody earlier saying the Dillon law, which prohibits localities from doing these sorts of experiments. States that don't allow these experiments are less likely to be able to adopt what more successful states have been doing. Questions? Yeah.
So throughout this analysis, you start with a sort of an unstated assumption that politicians are policy seeking
Yeah.
and not office seeking.
Yeah.
And I wonder how the analysis would change if you assumed that politicians are office seeking. So for example, if you could show, for one, does the amount of money given by lobbyists and PACs who support these anti-smoking legislation predict other people adopting it? So if I look to the next state and I say, wow, look at that bonanza funding that these guys have been getting for their campaign coffers from these anti-smoking nuts, you know, oh man, we're gonna go and adopt all this stuff, right? Or, for example, if what you're really interested in is the money that comes in from compliance, maybe you should treat high compliers as people who are not susceptible to learning because they don't care. They've already got the money. And that people who are low compliers are particularly susceptible to learning. The other thing is like, right, Democrats might be more interested in these laws. And since you have a correlation between professionalism and Democratic legislatures, that could potentially, I don't know, I mean, I guess you control for it. So, but if there's collinearity there, that it could be more a relationship between Democratic legislatures adopting these sort of, you know, regulations that are the government interfering in the economy, and that's what Democrats love to do, right?
Right. So a couple of those things on your latter point about the correlation. I think that's right. On the first broader point about what we have an implicit assumption about politicians, yeah, I mean they're policy seeking here. At the same time, and so we thought about it. One of the things we were interested in is whether or not there have been a lot of cases in which there have been negative repercussions to the adoption of these laws. There's almost no cases in which these laws have later been rescinded, which is interesting. That's not something we expected to find. And so one way you could even think about the local adoptions law is that is sort of a measure of the, we call it policy expertise, but it could also be a political measure, right? That they're learning that this sort of law is safe within their state. That local governments are doing this, they're being passed, they're not being rescinded later on. And that frees them up to say, okay, this will be safe now if we adopt a law. At that stage, then, they can look to see which type of law they want to adopt. So I think there is a measure of that in there. It would be very nice if we had, there's two things that we don't have at all that would be very nice if we could have. One would be a measure of the policy success at the local level. So do local laws have effect within the city where they're passed? You know, do they reduce youth smoking and so on? We don't have that. And do they reduce smoking rates? There aren't data on smoking rates per city. The other would be when politicians have passed these sorts of laws, what are the effects for them afterwards? That is data we could get. We don't have that, but it would be an interesting thing to look at to see. In particular, I think a nice version of your question is, are there some states in which these are riskier propositions than in other states? Because you would certainly expect that to be the case.
It might be harder with smoking because it's hard to imagine that there are a lot of people who are throwing the bums out because of the anti-smoking laws.
Yeah.
But for sort of bigger budgetary policies or things like that, that you might find more of that.
Yeah.
So the data are based on a number of years, right? I wonder, have there been any changes at the federal law in terms of how they might affect incentive for states to emulate each other in terms of the stability of federal parameters?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. The short answer is no. There were a couple things that came up. One is what we used as a starting point for our scientific measure, which is they put into effect these rules about states having to adopt measures. They didn't say what measures. They just said you have to do something to lower the rates of smoking. But that takes place at the beginning of the period we're looking at. The other thing that took place during this time period, especially toward the beginning of it, and I can't remember exactly when it was. Matt, you might remember this. When did the FDA, when did Kessler try to?
94.
It was not, that's what I was saying, it was during the Clinton administration. So, yeah. So the FDA tried to assert regulatory authority over this. And the grounds on which they did it is that they said smoking is a pediatric disease. So it's very much geared toward these sorts of things. But it got struck down by the Supreme Court. Other than that, there were very few federal laws that were passed at this time. The things that were passed during this time were passed, President Clinton passed an executive order banning smoking in government buildings and things like that. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I had one question about the grants, and you mentioning the grant which been required. It was an incentive for people to adopt these laws.
Yeah.
Is there anything that ties the amount? Is there a formula to these grants that ties the amount that you get? There's not.
No, but that's a really good question. So it's a very general sort of thing that states can be threatened with loss of funds for two things. One is if they fail to submit a plan that the government approves. The second is if they're not showing progress. But that's as concrete as it gets. It doesn't say that you have to reduce by X% over time or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I don't know.
Okay.
It's interesting that if you Google FDAB, it immediately comes up with FDAB Brown and Williamson.
Ah.
Maybe it's just my G-phone. So, do you know how these laws were adopted? I live in California and have for a really long time, since I was 9 months. And much of this gets adopted by initiative here, and so measuring legislative professionalism may not tell us a whole lot about, for example, was it Prop 99? Was that the smoking legislation that Abadye and Heinz Mueller studied in their synthetic control study, what, 2008 or whatever? It was a smoking tax, but anyways, it was adopted by initiative, which tells me that in lots of places these things are going to be adopted by initiative.
Yeah. So I can give you a general answer, and I'd have to go back and look at the data. I'm trying to remember how they code this, and I think it is just any laws that are adopted at the state level. I don't think it's necessarily one that's done by the legislature. I mean, it creates a little bit of a problem for us either way, right? If it's just something that's adopted by state legislatures, then it's ignoring the ones that are done by initiative. If it's adopted by anything, then it's lumping the initiative ones in. We didn't separate that out in the data because they didn't have that in there. We have at various times controlled for whether or not the state has the initiative process. It's a blunt measure, but it at least gets at the possibility that this might happen, and that didn't seem to change things. But it would be something that we could probably go back and track those pretty easily. There's not that many of these.
Well, especially since it's a learning story.
Yeah, and I mean, that's right, you know, and stuff like Benke's work looks at how the state initiative can cause learning across states, this exact sort of diffusion pattern, yeah.
Well, it's particularly since the political consultants cross state
That's right,
lines.
right.
So, as far as I could tell in your answer on the question about your number of observations, you're looking at the average treatment effect for the treated. So it's the treatment is state B did something, and now it's all the other states who can possibly mimic state B. So the treatment happens, state B does something, now state A. So what you're trying to get at is the average treatment effect for the treated, but since you don't know either why state A adopted it, or if they in fact even knew about state B, we're getting the in sort of the intent to treat average treatment effect for the treated.
Yeah.
I don't know how you say that.
But I know what you meant. So that's one of the reasons that I was really thinking that the interstate relational considerations would matter, because that gives us a more concrete story, right? Because then we're not just putting in every dyad together, but we're saying...
Absolutely. I mean, you would really run up against the rare effects logit if you just threw in every state, every dyad.
Yeah.
So, I'm with you there, and this is fun, but I'm still trying to figure out what it means. Exactly. So we have a correlation, maybe, for the treated states.
Yeah. And we also, I think it goes beyond that though, so we have the correlation, and then we're telling a story about how the success of another state is more likely to matter under some conditions than others. So I think that's taking it another step, right? It's saying that to the extent that states can, with higher legislative capacity, are more likely to be able to learn from other states, we should see this effect. And when we do that, we see that effect, the combination of those two things, and not just, in some cases, not just the simple success effect. So I think that helps a little bit in that regard.
A somewhat related question. So your data shows what they do the next year, right? So wouldn't
Yeah.
I mean, many policies you won't sort of get the result, let people know until 2 or 3 years down?
Yeah, and so what happens is that keeps staying in the data set though, right? So we're the two pairs in the dyad. You've adopted a number of things. I don't adopt it in the next year. But then the following year, I still have the possibility, I still don't do it. The following year, I still have the possibility, then eventually I do that. So it stays in the data set that way. Once then I've adopted everything you've done, then it's not included in the analysis after that because I can't, unless you now adopt something new. Yeah.
Could you just remind us again of what you mean by success? Because that's one of the things that I found quite interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think in other policy areas, states adopt things that other states are doing that are not particularly successful. If you mean by success that they actually produce the result that the policy was intended to produce. And so I'm not sure I fully understand how you're measuring success and what you mean by success.
No, I'm glad you asked that question because I realized during the talk at a certain point that there was something else that I wanted to add. We're using success in a very specific way here. It's not that this policy is adopted and it leads to this smoking rate or this compliance rate, okay? That's really hard to disentangle, again, because of the way these are adopted, sometimes in bunches, sometimes individually. There's other things that can affect it. And so we don't have that. We've done some simple-minded tests where we look to see whether the passage of these laws are associated with success, and we see that they are. But in general, that's not what we're looking at here. What we're saying is that a state looks at another state that's been successful, meaning that they've got better compliance with the SINAR regulations, or they have lower rates of youth smoking, and then looks to see what policies does that state have in place. So it's not making a distinction that, it passed this law, therefore it has this success rate. It's related to that, but it's saying they're overall successful. We want to be like them. How can we do that? Well, the way we can do that is by seeing what their policy profile is, the overall set of policies they have, and then adopting them. So that's what we're looking at there. It's a little bit different version, and I should have explained that.
And so it's a relative success rate. So if
Yeah.
they're looking at compliance or they're looking at smoking rates, their rates are worse than the state that's looking at them by
That's right.
some amount.
Yeah, that's right. And so we're looking at the
do you
relative
have,
ratio.
do you have data on, do you have data on, is it usually the small marginal differences? Or?
No, the differences can be pretty big. So, we saw the earlier chart showing the differences in the SINAR ratio.
Mm-hmm.
So some states have, I forget what my range is. The averages are a little above 1, but I think that you get some very big ratios. It's 0.9. It's hard to translate. You can get a pretty wide range of discrepancies between the states. It's not unusual for one state to have a smoking rate for teenagers of 10% and another to have a 20%. So you do get a pretty wide range of these ratios. Now, we've done it without looking at ratios, like I said, and looking just at overall levels. That's initially, in the earlier version, how we had written this up. And we went back and forth on whether we prefer the ratios. And we decided that actually there is a case to be made for just using the levels, but that the ratio makes more sense. If you're a state and you're wanting to attack this problem you have of low compliance with the sign-R amendment, you're going to look around and you're going to be influenced more by states that are doing better than you are. And so it's, take two states that are each thinking of adopting. One is already doing pretty well, the other has a much higher non-compliance rate. This one is going to be able to learn from all of these states that are below it. This one, though, might have only a few states from which it's going to be willing to learn. And so that's why we think that taking the ratio into account makes sense.
I just had one other question.
Sure.
That is, that first geographic map that you showed, it was somewhat striking to me in that there were two types of states that have high youth smoking rates. One are sort of sparsely populated rural states in the northern part, all
Where it's really cold and
North Dakota, very cold, kind of hardly anybody lives
Yeah.
there. And then several of the tobacco states.
The tobacco growing states. That's right.
And I didn't know. Then we didn't hear it. I didn't know how that, because those seem very distinct clusters. But
Mhm.
that didn't seem to play into the explanation at all of people adopting this or anything else. So I just wonder how that cluster effect, which you seem to see visually, might have appeared in your data once you did your.
Yeah, so I mean, on one hand, we don't directly include that in any way. It does come into it in a couple different ways. One is we look to see whether neighboring states have an effect. The other is by clustering, we're saying we're not treating all of these state Bs as if they're independent, that there are certain groups of states that there's something about these states that we're not accounting for, and that something might be whether they're all in tobacco growing region. Now, we're controlling for tobacco growing, but we're not controlling for sparsely populated rural areas or things like that.
You're basically treating that as a nuisance.
That's right. That's right. So, but it would be something that we could model. I mean, if we wanted to, if that was something we were interested in understanding, we could look at that. Yeah.
Is there time for one more question, or off to dinner?
I do have a question, and you raised it yourself, and that is,
Okay.
I think you need taxes.
Do you?
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me why, because we've gone back and forth on this. I initially was one of the co-author pair that said we need taxes, and Craig wasn't, and we
You're
flipped
right.
a couple times. Yeah.
You're right. I think because it's going to affect the smoking rates, and that's one of your important variables. But also, it's just, you think about this in terms of states' willingness to adopt things. So many sin taxes and excise taxes are already on the books. It's a relatively low cost thing to implement,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's a revenue incentive for doing it if you look at that. And so as a result, right, my suspicion is, unless there's been no action, right, during your time period in the movement for taxes, I kind of think it needs to be in there because.
I just checked that
Yeah.
a month ago because I was hoping there was no action.
What was there?
There's action.
Yeah. And that, basically
it's-
because I study taxes, they're extremely important.
Yeah, and it's not a ton of action, but there's enough that there's something going on. I'll say something about that in a second. So it's something where, but at the same time, what taxes affect is the likelihood, it gets into the elasticity of smoking for teenagers and stuff. It gets into the likelihood that kids are going to smoke. That's not what we're measuring as a dependent variable, right? So it's whether or not state A is moving in the direction of state B.
But it's a policy instrument.
It's a policy instrument,
Right?
that's
It's
right.
one of those suite of tools that you could, right? And it's tough, right? I understand why you'd be sort of averse to doing it, but
Yeah.
Isn't it pretty highly correlated with the tobacco industry? The size of the tobacco, the change might not be highly correlated, but the
I-
initial tax
I actually think it's probably not hugely correlated. I think there are some obvious ones where it's a high-producing state in a very low tax rate, but then there's a pretty big
There
range.
aren't that many real tobacco states.
Right, there's like 4 of them that do 80 or 90% of it or something, yeah.
All right, folks.
All right, thanks for the feedback.